There are two things that all Christians have in common, two beliefs, right? The first thing that every believer understands is that we are all rotten sinners, or at least you should understand that. Come and see me afterwards if you don't, right? In fact, you can't be a Christian unless in your heart you acknowledge that you're a sinner, you've broken God's law. You acknowledge you've done things which aren't good, and we continue to do things which aren't good. Sometimes the things we do are outright bad, aren't they? We know they're bad as we're doing them. But a Christian is someone who's acknowledged that they're not a good person, they're a bad person. We've let God down. We've got nothing to offer God except broken promises, half-truths, and messy lives. So that's the first thing. Second thing we've got in common is that we as Christians know that we've been forgiven. Forgiveness is the backbone of our faith, isn't it? This is why Jesus died on the cross. He died so that we can personally be forgiven, pardoned for all those bad, rotten things we do and continue to do. And if you stop to think about it, that's great, isn't it? That's awesome. Forgiveness is amazing. But if you're anything like me, you'll also find that forgiveness is a bit alien to you. We love the fact and we glorify the fact, we glorify God because he's forgiven us. But as fallen, sinful people, we find it tremendously difficult to forgive others, don't we? We hold grudges, we've got long memories. We find forgiveness tough to do. And actually, society is the same. Society is worse. People in the Western world increasingly want to take offence at everything. So people today go around sniffing around for things that are likely to upset them. It's almost like they want to be at odds with their neighbours. They want to feel like they've been wronged. So people look for old tweets or things written on social media. Oh, you've offended me there. Your words offend me. You didn't acknowledge me. Or you didn't mention me enough. I listened to a woman, this is real, right? I listened to a woman moaning for 30 minutes on the phone once because she wasn't happy with the table she'd been placed on at a wedding. And this really upset her. And I got it in the ear. It wasn't my wedding. But society is addicted to feeling offended. And the reason people want to play the victim is because if I feel you've sinned against me, well, then I get to sin back against you. I can call for retribution. I can demand that you lose your job or you lose your status. I can use the sin you've committed, whether real or imagined, to try and get an advantage for myself. Or even more subtly, I can use it to justify my hatred or dislike of you. I can disregard what you've said if you've offended me. Our society has become less and less forgiving, hasn't it? Less forgiving and more vindictive. So now people it's called cancel culture. Something's said, but a simple apology won't work. No, you've got to lose your job. You've got to lose that position. And because we're part of this society, well, we get poisoned by this thinking. And the devil uses it to divide people and divide churches. Well, look, this is nothing new. First century Israel was no different. People were always upsetting each other and falling out with one another. That's why we read verse 15 to 19. Jesus teaches us how to deal with problems as individuals in the church. So he says, look, if someone upsets you, go and have it out with them. Go and see them privately. Be honest with them. And work it out. Forgive one another. And then if not, we'll take it a bit further. Go to others. But on hearing about forgiveness, Peter wants to know a bit more. Verse 21, then Peter came to him and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? So this sermon, as you can tell, was all about forgiveness. How are we as believers meant to treat those who've sinned against us. We've got three things to say tonight, right? And they all begin with the letter P, just to help you. P's, all preachers use P. There's a lot of words beginning with P. So first we're going to look at the parable, right? Then we'll look at the picture. And finally we'll see what the point is. So Peter is a bit of a mathematician, isn't he? Jesus has been talking about resolving conflicts with your brothers and sisters, but Peter wants to know more. If I'm to forgive people, he asks Jesus, well, how many times? And he throws out a suggestion of 7. Now with 7, Peter thinks he's being very lenient. The rabbis of the day would have suggested 3 as the maximum number of times that you should forgive someone. So the scribes, the Pharisees, the priests of the day would say, well, yeah, you forgive someone, but there is a limit. So the 4th time that, I don't know, Joe doesn't return my spanner, well, I don't have to forgive him. I can cut him out of my life. I no longer have to have a relationship with him. So Peter, knowing that the religious leaders are saying 3, well, he adds a few more on. He knows they can't be right. It can't be 3. It's got to be a few more. We'll say 7. 7's a nice biblical number, isn't it? But on hearing Peter's suggestion, Jesus blows that figure out of the water. Verse 22, Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 77 times, or 70 times 7, you can read it. Jesus says, when it comes to forgiveness, you're on completely the wrong scale. You can't measure forgiveness on an abacus. To illustrate this point, Jesus tells the parable of the unforgiving servant. So look at verse 23 and 24. It says this. Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. So here's a king, imagine a ruler, and he's looking at his books, and one chap, he realises, owes him 10,000 talents. Now, because we're modern readers, 10,000, see that figure, it doesn't seem like that much, does it? 10,000 talents, we think, well, maybe it's like 10,000 pounds. And although that's quite a lot, it's not insurmountable. But that is not what 10,000 talents is worth. To understand the gravity, to understand how much this man owes, let's think about being paid for our time. So ancient people didn't receive a flat salary. They were paid daily. They were paid for their time, a daily wage. If they didn't work, they wouldn't eat. So the average man on the street, listening to Jesus, to earn 1 talent, they knew they would have to work every day for 20 years. All right, so let's try and bring that into a modern context. Imagine a man, he works in Tesco's on minimum wage, right? But he's got his heart set on buying his dream car. Let's say his dream car is a Lamborghini, all right? And it costs £200,000. So that man knows if he works hard, he works all the hours he can, 15 hours a day, and he saves and he only eats corned beef, he knows he might be able to save enough and buy his dream car in 20 years. Well, that is the modern equivalent of just 1 talent. But of course, the guy in the story doesn't owe 1 talent, does he? He owes 10,000 talents. He owes 200,000 years' work. This man owes his master 200,000 years' worth of time. But there's something else going on in the story. See, 10,000 was the largest number that the ancient Greeks had. Now, the ancient Greeks were the brains of the ancient world. They were the thinkers, the academics, the educated. They were the top mathematicians. And they had no way of writing 10,001. It was the biggest number you could record in ancient times. So Jesus is using the biggest number you can recall, 10,000, and he's using the largest unit of currency, the talent. So do you see what Jesus is doing? He's taking the largest number and the largest unit of currency, and he's saying this is this man's debt. Jesus is ramping up the theatre. He's ramping up the threat. That's a feature of his parables. He does it a lot. So think about it. When we tell kids the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, we don't just say there's a giant after Jack, do we? No, this is an ugly giant. He's really ugly. He's got warts. And he's angry. And he eats little kids like Jack, and he can smell them. He even knows their nationality. You up the tension. Well, that's what Jesus is doing here. This guy's not just in debt. He's got a giant debt. An ugly, scary debt that has far-reaching consequences. Verse 25, but as he was not able to pay, his master commanded that he should be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and that payment be made. Now, outside of Israel, this was common practice. Insolvent debtors could be sold into slavery. And in a worst-case scenario, not just you, but actually your whole house, your whole family could be sold. So now this man, he faces the prospect of being completely abandoned, completely deserted and left alone, never going to see his wife and kids again. His children are going to grow up in someone else's house. His entire existence from here on in will be one of isolation from those he loves. It will be an existence of total misery and regret. But even if they took his wife and his kids and everything he owned, well, it still would be but a drop in the ocean, wouldn't it? For the actual amount of money he owes. Selling all his stuff would come nowhere near to repaying that 200,000 years worth of debt. Verse 26, therefore the servant fell down before him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. This man is crushed. He's clutching at straws. He says, look, I'll pay you everything. Just give me a little more time. It's amazing, isn't it? No matter what trouble people get themselves into, there's always a part of them that thinks, well, I can sort this out. I've got enough nous to figure it out. I can do it. Verse 27, and the master of that servant was moved with compassion. He released him and forgave him the debt. This is staggering, isn't it? 200,000 years worth of debt. And the king simply writes it off. He forgives his servant. And forgiveness cost the king, didn't it? This king has lost out big time. He owes 10,000 talents. So the king is now 10,000 talents down. So the king is merciful. He doesn't give his servant what he deserves. He says, I'm going to give up my claim on your life and your time and your family. You're now safe. He's merciful and he's gracious. He shows this man unmerited favour. It's a gift. Your debt is cleared. In essence, he's given him 10,000 talents. And then he's released. The man walks out of the palace scot-free. And what a relief he must have felt. He lets out that long sigh. Oh, the burden's lifted from his shoulders. He bounces out of there. Verse 28. But that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And he laid hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, pay me what you owe. Look closely. Look, the first servant went out and he found one of his fellow servants. He goes out looking for him. What's this first servant's rationale? What's his reasoning? He's just been forgiven all of this debt, but now he goes out looking for another man who owes him money. Well, I think in his head he probably blames the second servant, we'll call him. If I hadn't been so generous in the first place, I never would have gotten into this mess. Well, the first servant owed 200,000 years' worth of debt. How much does his servant, the second servant, owe him? Well, it says 100 denarii. 100 denarii is simply 100 days' pay. So for ease, these days, let's call it £7,000, about £7,500 in today's money. A good chunk of money, but nothing compared to the billions of pounds that the first servant has been forgiven. And verse 28 says that he grabbed him by the throat. Before he even started talking to him, he finds him and he grabs him. It was custom in the day, it was ancient law, that you could drag a debtor into court by their face. So you grab their ears or grab their nose and yank them. You could humiliate them all the way to court. And that's what this man does. He's enraged with his fellow servant. And notice how the plea of the second servant in verse 29 is almost exactly the same as the plea of the first servant in verse 26. So his fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you all." Unlike the first servant, the second servant could have paid him, couldn't he? He could actually pay him back £7,000. It's doable. It's not going to take him 200,000 years to do it. But this man who's just been forgiven is completely unreasonable. Grabs him by the throat, he chokes him out, and then he vindictively throws him into prison. Verse 30, until he should pay all the debt. Now, because the second servant's debt is so small, the first servant couldn't legally sell him into slavery. But he was permitted to have him thrown in something called debtor's prison. So imagine in the ancient world, Bob has lent £7,000 from me, but he can't pay it back. So I then have Bob arrested, I drag him into prison, and I stick him in a cell. And nailed to the door is the debt that Bob owes. So you stick £7,000 on the entrance. Now, if Bob's family want to see him again, if Vicky wants him back, she has to stump up the money. She has to pay the ransom to release Bob. So this second servant has to stay in prison until someone in his family can redeem him, buy him back. And I get a sense here that with the first servant, he wants everyone else to see how tough he is. You don't mess with me. You don't dare not pay me back. Anyone else who owes me money, well, they better get their act together soon, or you're going to end up like that bloke. Verse 31, when the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. The audacity, the hypocrisy of this first servant is staggering, isn't it? But it doesn't go unnoticed by everyone else. They see it. Other people see it. And of course, they react how we would react. How dare he treat his servant like this? This is so unfair. Verse 32, then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I cancelled all the debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay. Jailers in the ancient world would get bored. And in order to pass the time, they would assault and torture their prisoners. Never enough to kill them, but always enough to make their lives a misery. Imagine a cat that's got a mouse. They just play with them, don't they? The mouse isn't food, it's entertainment. Well, the guards would get a real kick out of tormenting their guests. A lot of them were sadists. And what some get stuck up against the first man's cell? How much does he owe? 10,000 talents. Who in his family can pay the ransom? No one. How long will he be in prison? Forever. Okay, that's the parable. Second point. What's the picture? Well, When I first preached this sermon, our national debt was £2.6 trillion. I looked it up earlier today. It's now £3,485,919,000, and then it keeps going. This is the national debt of our country. It shows how much money the British government owe. And if you go on the website, it's just ticking over and over and over and over. It's going up at £5,170 per second. That's how much you and I as taxpayers owe. I don't even know who we owe it to. I don't understand it. But it's going up. That's all we need to know. Well, why bring this up? Well, the Bible talks about our sin as a debt. The Lord's Prayer, we say it every Sunday morning, don't we? Forgive us our debts or our trespasses as we forgive our debtors. Every time we break the Ten Commandments, every time we break God's law, our debt clock ticks over. Another lie, another lustful thought, another bout of rage, a bit more envy, and the debt just ticks up and up and up. In our natural human state, we anger God more and more every day. Our sin just keeps piling on top of each other. But of course, one day God's going to check his accounts, isn't he? And he's going to demand that everyone pays up. And just like in our parable, God has a prison cell where those who've offended him feel the full force of his anger. Where people will stay until they've paid back everything they owe. And since there's no way they can pay him back, well, they'll stay there forever. And that place is called hell. So if you're not a Christian here tonight, understand this is the predicament you're in. One day you will die and you'll have to settle your account with God's. And he'll look at your life and he'll look at your sin and he'll look at your debt and he'll throw you out of his presence. Well, that's the bad news. But what do we learn about the character of God from this parable? Well, the king in the parable is gracious, isn't he? He forgives the most ludicrously high debt of the first servant. This first servant owes billions, if not trillions of pounds. But the king simply says, go, you're forgiven. I make no claim on your life, I make no claim on your house or your property. Go in peace. And that's the offer that God makes to every human being on the planet. He says to human beings, you can have your sin debt removed, wiped clean. Well, how? Well, Romans 6:23 tells us that the wages of sin is death. Because of our wrongdoing, because of that debt that's going up and up and up, we've all been sentenced to death. And we see that and we feel that, haven't we? We've talked about that this morning. We're getting older, our bodies ache. And it's our sin, it's us breaking God's law that has caused that. But worse, our sin means that we've been separated from God. We can't come into contact, we can't have a relationship with him because we've been contaminated by our own sin. God is pure and spotless and holy and lovely, but we're covered in filth. Well, how can we wash away that filth? How can we have our debt forgiven, paid off? Well, Hebrews 9:22 says, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. So we know the Old Testament, as the ancient Israelites came before God, they acknowledged that their sin was terrible. And God had instructed them to bring a lamb. And God said, look, kill the lamb instead of me killing you. Let its blood be shed instead of yours. So the ancient Israelite would bring the lamb, and the lamb would pay the price of the sin. The lamb would be the sacrifice. It would pay the sin debt. And therefore, in ancient Israel, they could have somewhat a relationship with God. They knew something of his presence and his blessing. But of course, those lambs of the Old Testament were never enough because it wasn't a fair swap. They were only ever pointing to Jesus, the Son of God, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. He was the ultimate and final sacrifice for sin. So Jesus died on the cross. He experienced death and torment and darkness and misery so that we, his people, won't have to. John 19 verse 30 says this: when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished," and bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. And of course, that term, "it is finished," it means paid in full. That debt that my people have amassed, that you and I have amassed, Jesus said, "I've done enough. I've paid for it." And that means instead of death, well, Jesus' people receive life. We now live after we die. We were in debtor's prison. The bill was hammered to the door. But it's not a rich uncle who stumped up the cash. It's God himself. It's Jesus. He signed the cheque in his own blood and he banked it with his resurrection. So do you see the picture? Do you see also that forgiveness doesn't come easy? We often think that, forgiveness is free, but it's not free. It didn't come easy to God. God can't just wave a magic wand and make everything okay. No, it cost God everything to win us forgiveness. He had his own son executed on a cross and thrown into the darkest torment imaginable so that we could be let off, so that we could be forgiven. Let me ask you tonight, have you asked Jesus to pay off your debt? You can have every sin you've ever committed legally written off. And all you've got to do is accept Jesus' offer. Call out to him, call out to the King for mercy. Okay, we've got the parable, we've got the picture. Finally then, the point. Back a long time ago, as you know, I was a primary school teacher. And I taught year one. Now, year one was, if you're going to teach in primary school, year one's quite fun. In year one, in the morning, you do English and maths. But in the afternoon, they get at least at my school, they got multiple choice. So they get to play. They get to make models, so you'd have a little area for art, a little junk modelling section. You'd have some plasticine. They could make cakes. And in the afternoon, the kids could choose whatever they wanted to do. They could play outside. It was great. But they'd leave year one, and then my kids were going to year two, but I was still a year one teacher. And so in September, after a couple of weeks, I'd have kids I used to teach in year one coming back to me and they say, Mr. Whitten, can we come back? Can we come back into year one? We want to, in the old days, we used to play with Lego and dinosaurs in the afternoon. But now they're trying to make us do geography. Who wants to do geography? It's boring. Now, what did I say to my former pupils? I said, look, sorry guys, look, that is not an option. Your status has now changed. You were year one, but now you're year two. Now you're different. And because you're year two, there are different expectations. So playing with dinosaurs in the afternoon is no longer an option. Once when Harry was really, really little, he decided to put on one of Flick's dresses. And of course I said, look, Harry, no. Dressing like a girl is not an option. Well, you see what Jesus is saying to Peter? He says, if you're part of God's kingdom, you've got to consider what God has done for you. In that respect, each one of us is like that first servant. We have been forgiven everything. That astronomical debt that we owe to God has been paid off. It's been wiped away by Jesus. A tremendous gift. But with that forgiveness, well, it means we've got a new status. And therefore, God's expectations of you, of me, have changed. Here's what Jesus wants Peter to see. And it's that for a Christian, being unforgiving is simply not an option. Holding a grudge against someone who's done you wrong is no longer on the cards. Not now that you're part of his kingdom. How can we say this? Well, look at verse 35. It's a frightening verse, I think. Jesus says, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." What is the fate of people who are unwilling to show forgiveness? Well, it's eternal judgment, Jesus says. You'll share the same fate as that first servant. Understand this, Christian friend. Let me be clear, right? Jesus is saying forgiven people are forgiving people. This is not where I say, well, this is what you should do this week. This is what you ought to do. No, if you're a Christian, you will be a forgiving person. Well, there are two barriers which we as fallen human beings are up against when it comes to living like this. Again, they both begin with P, just for ease. The first one is privacy. Now, as Christians, some of us are very good at keeping the rules, aren't we? And often they're rules we've created for ourselves. And there's nothing wrong with that. We create little rules for ourselves so that we don't let God down. And that's fine. So as far as outward morality is concerned, we can seem to be ticking all the boxes, can't we? We're keeping the little rules we've set ourselves. But Christian friend, I'll challenge you tonight, if that's you. How good are you at living by this rule? Because keeping the rules outwardly, keeping the rules you've set yourself, is easy, isn't it? And it's obvious to everyone you're doing it. But this rule, living like this, in essence, being gracious, really forgiving people, is hard. And of course, you can break this rule and no one else will know. Because it's private. Jesus says you have to forgive people from where? From your heart. But of course, if you don't, no one's going to know. I've been a Christian a long time. I'm a pastor. I know I should forgive people when they do me wrong. And think about it. It's easy to say to someone, yeah, it's all right. You're forgiven. But in our hearts, well, sometimes we say it, but we still feel that bitterness. We still feel that anger, that resentment. There have been people who've wronged me in the past, and I've said, okay, yeah, that's fine, that's all right. But then what? Well, look, here's the trouble. I find myself celebrating their misfortune. I find that in my heart, a piece of me still wants to get my own back. And of course, no one else knows because it's private. Keeley doesn't know. My friends don't know. The congregation don't know. And therefore, they can't rebuke me for it, can they? Because it's in my heart. But of course, God knows. And that's scary. Look, verse 35. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from where? From your heart. Jesus says to me and everyone who's part of his kingdom, being unforgiving is no longer an option. It's like a 17-year-old saying, well, I want to go to nursery. It's like Harry trying to wear a dress. No, your status has changed. You are forgiven. So that's the first obstacle, privacy. Second obstacle we get when it comes to forgiveness is pride. Peter, remember, is Jesus' best friend. Him and John are in Jesus' tightest circle. Earlier in this chapter, we see the disciples having an argument. They're arguing about who's going to be top dog. How does Christ respond? Well, look at verse 3. He tells them, your attitude has to be that of a child. Jesus' kingdom is full of lowly, humble people. So think back to Peter's original question in verse 21. What would stop him from forgiving his brother the 8th time if someone did something wrong against him? Well, Peter's big problem, our big problem at this stage in life is pride. Jesus is telling him in this parable, Peter, you're not humble enough. And if we're honest, it's pride that keeps us from forgiving others, isn't it? Someone does you wrong and you think, well, how could you do that to me? After everything I've done for you, how could you do that to me? I mean, this is me. Why would you do that? And if I forgive them, if I let it go, well, they'll just do it again. They're just going to... I'm going to be a mug. And I'll appear weak if I forgive them. No, they owe me. And we can't restore our relationship until they've made amends, till they've paid me back. And of course, when the person who's wronged us can't make amends and can't pay us back, well, they think, well, I'll make them pay then. Thomas Chalmers said, unforgiveness is the poison we drink, hoping another will die. So I want that person to really know what they've done to me. I want them to feel the bitterness and pain that I feel. So I'm going to treat them as badly as I possibly can. I'll run them down behind their back. I'll blank them if I see them in the street. Maybe I'll cuss them online. I will make them pay me back. They hurt me, so I'll hurt them in return. But when we do that, it's us who are drinking the poison. We're the ones who get bitter. We're the ones who lose out. And of course, the root cause is pride, isn't it? And I know this is a real issue in churches because I've seen it. I know a church where some members don't speak to each other. So if Ethel is on tea duty, this is true and sad, if Ethel's on tea duty, she refuses to serve Enid. Enid has to go and say, can you get me a drink? Because she won't serve me. Think of how ridiculous and how petty our unforgiveness looks. We look at that first servant and we think, what an idiot. How could he be like that? But that's us. Jesus has forgiven us everything. But some of us still go out searching for people who owe us. Go out looking to be offended so that we can revel in revenge. So we can grab them by the face and haul them off to prison. God's kingdom is based on forgiveness. Each of us are only here tonight. We're only part of the church because God has forgiven each one of us. Christian friend, this has serious ramifications for us. If you're not willing to forgive other people, then perhaps you haven't fully grasped what God has done for you. Now, no, this is relatively easy for me to say. I know that some of you, there might be some who've had really, really terrible experiences. Some people have been sinned against so badly, and those sins can be extremely hard to forgive. And that's a battle that God will help every real believer overcome. But contemplate the lengths to which God himself went to forgive you from your sin. Think about it. The second person of the Trinity, God the Son, put on flesh. He went willingly to a dirty wooden cross, a cross that would have been stained with the dried blood of other criminals who'd gone before. And after being tortured all night, having been beaten, having been scourged, well, they took the Son of God's hands, the hands that had flung stars into space, and they drove huge nails through them. Feet that the book of Job tells us walked on top of the sky. They took those feet and they pinned them with nails 1/2 inch thick into that wooden cross. They butchered the Son of God. And God threw the full wrath, the full weight of his anger at his own Son. Why? Well, he did it because you and I owed him. Every day our sin ticked up and up and up. So on that cross, Jesus went and paid the debt that we owe. Jesus went into the darkness instead of us. He raided the kingdom of darkness, he paid the debt, and he brought us back. So, Christian friend, in light of that, is there any sin that anyone can do to any of us that we're not ready to forgive? If you're part of God's kingdom, being unforgiving is not an option. The forgiven will forgive.